Good morning, everybody. It's great to see you this morning. We're glad that you're here. We've got a beautiful Lord's Day, just gorgeous outdoors this morning, and we are blessed to be able to be inside together studying from the Word of God. We are studying in Ecclesiastes, but I think that's the last time I'm going to say that because I believe we're going to wrap that up. My intention is to wrap that up this morning, studying the book of Ecclesiastes. Just as a heads up, our plan is to go into the book of Hebrews, and a study guide for Hebrews has been printed. It's on the table in the back. I know a number of you have picked that up already. There's some more copies back, and we can make more if we need them. So our plan will be to conclude Ecclesiastes this morning and be ready to move into Hebrews. As we've been saying over and over again, Ecclesiastes is a powerful book. There's important and really impressive truths discussed in the book of Ecclesiastes. Solomon came at this from two perspectives, and we've been talking about this over and over and over again. I know those of you who've been in the class are probably weary of hearing it, but in part of the passages he'll be talking about life from a purely this world perspective, and man, he is how would we say, he's bummed out. I mean, life from just this world view is not a really great existence. But then he flips and he'll talk about life with an understanding that God is in the picture, and then it makes sense. And so Solomon wrote this approximately 3,000 years ago. That observation is still perfectly true. Life without God makes no sense at all. It's meaningless. There's no reason for it. Put God in the perspective, then it makes sense. Then you can connect all the dots if there is a God. And so Solomon went through that. And this, hopefully this is the last time you have to look at this chart we've had up here every week. The book is divided by almost any commentator that you read after, and just by your own analysis, I think you would come to this conclusion. The book is divided into four principal sections because Solomon, Ecclesiastes, he is the preacher. Most commentators call them sermons, four sermons. And you can see where the sermons start and end, and each sermon or section of the book has those two elements. First part, life without God. Second part, life with God. And so we have gone through each of those sections, and we are in the last section, so the fourth sermon, the last section in chapter 12 is where we are. This is a really well-known part of the book of Ecclesiastes. Of course, he ends chapter 11 and starts chapter 12 talking to the young people. And a very famous verse often quoted is chapter 12 verse 1. Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them. I have no pleasure in life anymore. I've gotten old. So he says, remember God while you're young, while you still have energy and strength, enthusiasm for doing the work of God, because you're going to get old. And you're going to say, I don't enjoy my life anymore. Life is not enjoyable to me anymore. And then he goes on to describe some of what will happen to us all as we get old. And those of us who are older can readily relate to many of the things that he describes here as some of the things that come on with old age. David Bolden is not here this morning. He's not feeling well. Last week he told me, as we were starting into this section, he said, you were talking about me the whole time this morning. I don't know, we were talking about all of us who are older, the infirmities of old age. So we've talked about some of this, but let's just read it again and then we'll pick up where we left off last week. Chapter 12 of Ecclesiastes, verse 2. So, remember thy Creator in the days of thy youth. Notice, and so now what's going to happen? While the sun or the light or the moon or the stars be not darkened, nor the clouds return after the rain. In the days when the keepers of the house shall tremble, and the strong men shall bow themselves, and the grinders cease because they are few, and those that look out the windows be darkened. And the doors shall be shut in the streets when the sound of the grinding is low, and he shall rise up at the voice of the bird, and all the daughters of music shall be brought low. And when they shall be afraid of that which is high, and fear shall be in the way, and the almond tree shall flourish, and the grasshoppers shall be a burden, and desire shall fail, because man goeth to his long home, and the mourners go about the streets. Or ever the silver cord be loosed, or the golden bowl be broken, or the pitcher be broken at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern, then shall the dust return to earth as it was, and the spirit shall return to God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, vanity of vanities, say the preachers, all is vanity. All right, we talked about several of these things, and I think it's just such an intriguing description of old age and the things that come with old age. When you remember, I created in the days of thy youth, because here's what's going to happen. The sun, the light, the moon, the stars will be darkened. And we talked about that last week. And I really believe that here he's talking about our thinking powers, our intellectual capacity. Now, it could be taken that he was talking about our eyesight, but I actually think he's not, because I think he's going to mention eyesight down here in verse 3. So here I think when he talks about the sun, the light, the moon, the stars, be not darkened when you're young, but they will be when you're old, I think he's talking about thinking powers. How often do we describe somebody, and so maybe somebody who's quite older, and the question, is he still in his right mind? What we're saying there, has he developed dementia? We used to call it senility. Now we call it dementia. But that's something that we think about old people. They get to where they're not thinking too clearly anymore. I believe that's what he has in mind. Tom?
He also uses those analogies of stars and for references kings and wise people and things like that.
Yeah.
The language harmonizes with the other writings that he's done in those analogies.
I think you're right. Okay, so he says, nor the clouds return after the rain. When you're young, so you have a stormy day, things don't go well. But that just lasts for a day. Tomorrow the sun is shining and you're back about your business again, no problems. When you get old, you have a bad day, maybe physical health or other things that are afflicting you. But the clouds don't go away. So today was a bad day, and the clouds linger tomorrow. Tomorrow's a bad day too. One bad day follows another when you get old. When you're young, you have a bad day, everything be cleared up tomorrow. Not when you're old, he says. He says, in the day when the keepers of the house shall tremble. The keepers of the house, most people think that that's a reference to the hands, and they tremble. And as we said last week, and we talked about this, we were right at this point last week. How often do you see old people and their hands just shaking like that? I mean, not when they're not doing anything, and they have these tremors of old age. We associate that many times with Parkinson's disease, but it also just it just encroaches in old age when your hands just sort of tremble when you're not doing anything. And I think that's what he's talking about there. And then he says, the strong men shall bow themselves. And as we said last week, probably the legs and or the back, that which you use to really bear loads. That's you lift with your legs and your back. My grandmother always said, lift with your legs, not your back. Save your back. She'd always say, save your back. But when you're old, you're hunched over. I mean, that almost is unavoidable. You see old people and they bend over. That's what he's talking about there. So serve God in your youth before these kind of things happen to you, he says. All right, I think we talked about all that last night. The next one's obvious. The grinders cease because they are few. What's the problem? He lost his teeth. He doesn't have any teeth. He can't chew his food anymore. So the grinding ceases. The grinders cease because they're few. Those that look out the windows be darkened. That's your eyes there, right? And we've come a long way. For instance, it wasn't just a generation or so ago when almost everybody who was old had false teeth because they lost their teeth. Now, because of advances in dental care, many times old people can keep their own teeth till they die. That's a blessing. Same thing can be true about care of the eyes. It was very common, not that long ago, for people who got old to have very much trouble with their eyesight. Cataracts are a naturally occurring thing. Almost everybody will eventually develop cataracts, but glaucoma and other macular degeneration. You know, it's kind of interesting when you read in the Bible about old people in the Bible. Many of them are described as their eyesight had dimmed. Remember, Isaac could be deceived by Jacob. Couldn't even recognize his own sons close up. Had to touch to see if he was talking to Esau or Jacob, and that was used as the means of deceiving him. So that was pretty common. When you think about these things, even though we kind of complain about the frailties of old age, we live in a time when we're able to mitigate some of the things that happen, but it's still going to happen. Even in our time of advanced medical technology, a lot of this is completely unavoidable. It's going to happen. Verse 4, the doors shall be shut in the street when the sound of grinding is low. That was a little bit odd, but I think what it's talking about there, the doors shall be shut in the street when the sound of grinding is low. I think the last part of that helps us understand what he's talking about. The first, grinders, that's teeth. We already said that. So the doors are shut in the street. Probably talking about your lips closed. Your lips are closed because I don't want everybody to see that I've lost all my teeth. Your lips are closed over toothless gums, and so have you ever seen an old person who's obviously self-conscious about the fact that they lost their teeth, and so they kind of keep their mouth tightly shut so that that's not quite so obvious. Again, they're doing that because the sound of grinding is low. They've lost most of their teeth. He shall rise up at the voice of a bird. Here he's describing that the old person doesn't sleep well, and the slightest thing will disturb his sleep, and he wakes up. Boy, I can vouch for that. I've got to the point where I do not sleep well. I talk to a lot of older folks who just say, I just don't sleep well anymore. I used to sleep so good, man. I used to hit the pillow and not move till morning. Now I flip and flop all night long. The slightest little sound wakes me up. Well, that's a characteristic of old age. He wakes at the sound of the slightest thing will disturb his sleep, and he can't go back to sleep. Pretty obvious. He says, and the daughters of music shall be brought low. This is what's really weird. So this is talking about daughters of music. I think it's talking about your ears and probably your voice and ears. The daughters of music brought low. He's disturbed by the sound of a bird. The bird wakes him up in his sleep. But generally speaking, he can't hear a bell ringing because he's so hard of hearing, right? So I think that's the daughters of music. Hearing and maybe even voice, because our voice begins to fail as we get older. Daughters of music shall be brought low. He shall be afraid of that which is high. Again, I think some of us who are older can readily attest to fear of heights. It used to be I didn't care to climb up on a high roof. I know now, back 20 years ago plus, when I was working on my house, we got a real high-pitched roof, and I wanted to put a power vent fan right up at the peak of the roof. I crawled up there all by myself. There wasn't even anybody there that day when I did that. I went up there and cut that hole in that roof and put that vent fan in, and I look up there now and you couldn't pay me to get up there again. Well, what's the difference? 20 years is the difference. So when we're young, we don't think about that so much, but now, boy, I'm telling you. Huh? It's balance. That's the reason why.
Yeah, because I just see, out working, I notice just getting up on my trailer and on the rail, I have to look around for something to hold on to, just because, it doesn't take much to.
That's right.
Where before, you seem to be sure-footed and
exactly.
Bounce up on the trailer and jump off. Now, if I look to jump off, grab a hold of something.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
So it's there. And even going back to that daughters of music, it's those high, those high tones that you can't hear.
Can't hear them, you can't sing them.
Yeah, so it's in there.
Yeah, exactly right.
They tease about, men not being able to hear their wives. A lot of times it's because women tend to talk in a higher pitched voice.
Higher frequencies.
Higher frequency.
Yeah.
And we can't hear those higher frequencies.
Yeah. Again, I think it's just so amazing that we think we have come so far, and we certainly obviously have made advances, even in dealing with some of the frailties of old age, but the description is still spot on, right? I mean, Clayton?
The results of falling are much higher.
Exactly right.
Risk when they get older. I also want to back up on the sound of grinding as well. Mine had a note for deafness on that.
For what?
Deafness.
Okay.
You can't hear it.
You can't hear it. Even if there was grinding, you couldn't hear it. Yeah. All right. So again, just really, I think it's just an intriguing description of old age and the things that happen in old age. He says, so they shall be afraid of that which is high, and fears shall be in the way. I think this is a good one too, because I know Cindy and I, if we're getting ready, if we have to go someplace, get home, I don't know how often she will say, or I will say, "Oh, I want to get home before dark." When I was young, I wouldn't have cared to stay out all night. I don't care what time I get home. I'll do what needs to be done, and if I don't get home till midnight or 2:00 in the morning, I don't care. But boy, now we say, I think we better get home before dark. Lynn?
I heard Jeff Matthews on this one time. He was talking about this park. He said, "You ever driving down the road and you get stuck behind somebody driving really slow, and then you lose your temper and you're all frustrated and you drive past them, and it's a very elderly person."
Yeah.
He says, "Why are they driving slow?" Because there's terror in the world.
Yeah, exactly right. I think about my kids now, and I think, I wish they'd leave in time to get home before dark. They don't care. But now I'm old and I do care. So, I mean, that's just, again, a good description. Things you worry about, things on the way that you wouldn't even have thought about before, The almond tree shall flourish. What is that? The almond tree shall flourish. What is that? Lonnie?
I think he's talking about gray hair.
Gray or white hair, exactly right. The almond tree shall flourish. The grasshopper shall be a burden. That's a pretty obvious one, right? The grasshopper, you think about a grasshopper, how light they are afoot. So a grasshopper weighs practically nothing. And of course, this is hyperbole. He's using an exaggeration for emphasis. But, the lightest loads now are a burden. Something that you might used to have lifted or carried or really work in general that you would have previously done that wouldn't have bothered you the least. Now it's a burden. So that's the grasshopper shall be a burden. And desire shall fail. A couple things may be in mind there. Maybe, loss of appetite, for instance, that sometimes accompanies old age. This gives me some comfort that I'm not all that totally old yet, because I obviously still have a good appetite. But maybe even more, probably specifically, not to be too indelicate, but it may be a reference to sexual desire wanes in old age. And so that may be either one of those, I think, or maybe others could be in that as we age, some of the things we desire, we don't desire so much anymore. So desire shall fail, because man goes to his long home. Goes to his long home. Monty?
New King James says eternal home.
Eternal home.
Eternity is their home compared to our life.
Oh, I hadn't thought about that. So that version says eternal home, which is long, forever. I actually have understood this in the past to suggest the grave or your literally your coffin, your long home. They're going to lay you out in the coffin long ways. That's your long home. That's where they're going. Basically, they're going to bury you in the grave. But I think Monty's point. And I do have a note here. I hadn't even remembered my note that some other translations say eternal home, which would obviously be very long. So it's one or the other of those things. And I think some commentators say it literally suggests the idea of a coffin, and that may be. That explanation may be fortified by the last phrase in verse 5, and the mourners go about the streets. I think we're aware that in Eastern cultures they even pay for wailers to go in advance of the funeral procession, wailing out and moaning. And that's the idea here, that the mourners shall go about the streets. People either naturally mourning or even paid mourners who would wail as you're being carried to your burial is in that. Thoughts or comments? Wade?
Some of the other versions say that caper shrivels up.
For what? For which phrase?
In verse 5.
For which phrase?
After the grasshopper. After the phrase in the grasshopper.
Oh, when it's talking about the desire, King James says the desire fails. And I think that probably is the suggestion of caper bearing. It would, if you did a little research on that, I think that would be suggesting that maybe is linked to maybe specifically sexual desire. Any other thoughts? All right. Now, he changes just a little bit in tone at the start of verse 6. Or ever the silver cord be loosed, or the golden bowl be broken. Now that's a little bit odd, but my understanding is that that's describing a cord that suspends a lamp from the ceiling. Of course, it wouldn't be an electric lamp; it would be an oil lamp of some kind. So the cord is going to be broken. And what happens, of course, when the cord is loosed or broken, the bowl falls and is broken. So you've got this cord suspending a lamp, but the cord breaks, the lamp falls, the bowl is broken. What this is describing is end of life, right? Death. That's just a very poetic way of describing end of life. What holds it all together breaks, and life is over. So that's what he's describing. Tom?
The New American Standard also inserts, in italics, remember him before.
Remember him before this happened.
Before, life ends, you need to remember God.
Yeah.
You need to, make that right with God before.
Exactly right. Yeah. So all of this is in that sort of context of do what's right now, do it while you can, because all of these things are going to happen. And then, so all of these things happen, you're going to get old, and all these things are going to happen to you, and then you're going to die. So be sure to remember your Creator. He says, the pitcher be broken at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern. Again, I think this is the same idea of death. The pitcher be broken at the fountain. Well, then there's nothing left, right? If the pitcher's gone, or if the wheel is broken, you think of the wheel as what you would use to draw up the bucket from the well. If they're not there, there's nothing, right? You don't have a pitcher at the fountain, you don't have a wheel to pull the water up from. Life is over. Again, I think it's a description of that. Lynn?
I've heard some people talk about these two, especially the bowl and the pitcher, of being representative of the body being the container for the soul. We talk about the soul's way. Matter of fact, he mentions it in the very next verse.
Yeah.
So when the container is broken, what happens to the contents? They're spilled out and they're separated now from the container.
Yeah. Good. I think that's really good. Yeah, exactly. So he's talking about death there in verse 6. And then, so what happens when you die? Verse 7, then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it. That's what happens when you die, right? One of the things that's kind of interesting with medical technology and development is that it's become kind of a fuzzy realm to know when is a person really dead. You can keep a body on life support systems for a long time. But they say, yeah, but there's no brain activity. They're able to sense that there's not any activity in the brain. This person is what? He's brain dead, but they can keep his physical body and keep his heart beating, his respiration going artificially. And so they've made it so now they come to the family, and the question is, should we remove life support? Well, probably. Life may have already been gone if there is no brain activity, but they've kind of muddied that water. It's not quite so clear. I think the Bible gives the real definition of death is when the spirit departs the body. That's how the Bible defines death. Now again, that's hard for us to detect, and so again, with medical advances, it's a little harder to know when that has technically happened. But here, that's what he's describing here. So the spirit is returned to God who gave it. What's going to happen to your body? Your body's going to decompose and go back to the physical elements from which we are made. We talked about, I don't know how many of you were able to take in the virtual Bible study Thursday night, but we talked about some of these kind of things. And I titled our study Thursday night, Funeral Questions. There were a bunch of them that were all pretty much unrelated. But one of the questions we ask is, what about cremation? Could you cremate a body? Should you cremate it? But does the Bible either condone or condemn cremation? I don't think there's an answer. I don't think the Bible addresses that, especially in the New Testament. There's nothing in the New Testament that would even give a hint one way or the other, as far as I can tell. In the Old Testament, we made the observation from the Old Testament that burning bodies in the Old Testament was frequently associated with sort of condemnation. And so there's sort of, there's several episodes in the Old Testament, but there's some indication that the Jews in Old Testament times at least saw the burning of a body as a disgrace to the body. I don't see that in the New Testament at all. I don't think you could either condemn or condone cremation today. But I know that some people have here's sort of the misgiving about that. Well, if you cremate the body, what happens at the resurrection? At the resurrection, our physical bodies are going to be reunited with our spirits to stand before eternal judgment, the final judgment. Jesus said in John 5, "Marvel not at this, for the hour cometh, and now is, when all that are in the grave shall come forth. They that have done good to the resurrection of life, they that have done evil to the resurrection of damnation." So there's going to be a general resurrection, all of the dead, from all past times. All of the dead will be resurrected, and there will be a final judgment. Well, what about people whose bodies were cremated? There's not a body to resurrect. What about, or someone says, what about the bodies that were lost at sea? What about bodies that were devoured by wild beasts?
The scripture says that our bodies will be changed in a twinkling of an eye.
It's obviously going to be a miraculous thing, because even if you didn't cremate the body, given enough time, what's going to happen to the body? It's going to decompose. It's going to go back to the dust from which it was created. So, obviously by embalming techniques, we delay that process, but we don't delay it forever. Remember when Jesus went, when Lazarus had died and Mary and Martha called Jesus, and he had been in the grave 4 days. And Jesus said, "Open the grave." And they said, I think Martha was the one who said, "Surely by now he stinketh." In other words, what she was saying, the body is already well decomposed in 4 days, and it does. My understanding is that our physical bodies begin to decompose in about 4 hours after death. And that's why the Jews then, and even, I don't know whether you would call it Orthodox Jews, or maybe all Jews do, Jews don't do embalming, and they typically bury their dead within 24 hours. And there's a real practical reason for that. because they'll be stinking. Beyond that, the physical body will stink from decomposition. So your body's going to decompose. I don't care whether you burn the body, cremate it, and just have ashes left, or you bury it in the ground. You can bury it in the ground if you want to, and you can maybe delay the process, but the body's going to decompose. That's what bodies do, and that's what this verse says. Tom?
Interesting, it goes back when you look at the concept that, Solomon's talking about here corresponds to the creation when God created man.
From the dust.
Dust of the earth and breathed in his sight, and then it separates the two, that physical element from the spiritual element. That which gave life to body, God's taken back.
Yeah, exactly right.
And there's also that concept that it's his, and once it's his, it's to do with as he chooses. And basically, he's told us what's going to happen to those that have done obedient to him, and then what awaits those that aren't. God's going to deal with those in the way that he chooses to deal with.
Okay, all right. All right, so one last time, Solomon expresses frustration over the view of all of this. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, all is vanity. If this life is all there is. So think about that. Think about that conclusion based upon what he's just described. What's he just described? What he's just described is, I'm going to get old and sick and die. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. If that's all there is, it's not much. If that's all there is it even worth living? Lynn?
This is one of those spots, the verse previous when he talks about the returning law, God, it's always jumped out at me. I'm sure y'all talked about it, you've been in your study for a while now, but at the very beginning, it's like he doesn't even mention God for a while. And he's talking about earth from the point of view of living here. I think it's a very relevant question for the times we live in with all the atheism and stuff we have today. It's almost like he walks it through from their point of view.
Yeah.
But in some people have made the argument, well, he's saying it's good to live as God on earth, but it's still not all there is. But then he says that, but the spirit returns to God.
Yeah.
That's an important part, because that says that the only chance of no vanity is that part.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Tom?
All the way through here, in almost every section, he deals with the concept of, man dying. One, he talked about his riches. You can acquire all the wealth you want, but it's going to go to somebody else.
Yeah.
Here he dealt with, your physical attributes, your health and things. That, talks about. He talks another place about your youth, and then that's going to just, be done away with.
Nothing lasts. Nothing lasts.
Nothing lasts.
Yeah.
And he's just sort of coming down to that climax. And he sort of incorporates all those here in this one last, last hurrah.
Yeah, if you look at our chart where we kind of divided up the book into sections, we are in the last observation and conclusion. Some people call it an epilogue or a concluding section. Let's read now in verse 9. Beginning verse 9. Moreover, because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. Yea, he gave good heed and sought out and set in order many proverbs. The preacher sought to find out acceptable words, and that which was written was upright, even words of truth. The words of the wise are as goads, and as nails fastened by masters of assemblies, which are given from one shepherd. And further, by these, my son, be admonished, of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. Okay, break that down real quickly before we run out of time here. So he says, he sort of describes himself there in verse 9. He says he was wise. He again identifies himself as the preacher. I think it's kind of interesting that he identifies himself as a preacher instead of as the king. You would think, what's more important, to be a preacher of God's message or to be a king? Solomon was both and seemed to emphasize the greater value of being the preacher. So he says his words were wise because he was wise. He taught people. He was a teacher. He pondered and set forth many proverbs, he said. He used just the right words. Notice verse 10, acceptable words. He sought to find out the right words, the words that would get the message across to us. And he says that which was written was upright, words of truth. And so in those verses, he describes himself, and he sort of describes what he had set out to do, and I think did very well in providing wisdom, wise proverbs, and put them into words. I think that's interesting. He said he sought to find out acceptable words. I think that's really interesting, that there's a way to say things that will make the impression stick. And don't you think that throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon's words are unique and powerful? How often do we quote the book of Ecclesiastes when we're preaching sermons? Very often. And for instance, the section that we just read about the description of old age, we've come across that many times, and it's very powerful. Could you have said it a different way? Could you have just simply said, you're going to get old, you're going to get sick, you're going to die? Well, yeah, you could have said it, but it wouldn't have sort of latched on to us like his words do. And so he said he sought to use acceptable or appropriate words, and it was true. He said he taught that which was true. Verse 11, the words of the wise are as goads. We've talked before about goads. We know that we don't use the word goads too much anymore. We would probably, I think we would use the word prod more than goad. But what that is something that if you're goading or prodding an animal, you're trying to get him to go. I got this old cow, and I'm trying to get her to go down the chute so we can give her shots. She doesn't want to go. I poke her. I poke at her to make her move in the right direction. That's the idea of goading or prodding. So what do the words of the wise, what should the words of the wise do to us? They should poke us or prod us to go in the right direction. And he said that's what he sought to do. The words of the wise are as goads, and as nails fastened by the masters of assemblies, which are given from one shepherd. So you got a master craftsman. You got a real cabinet maker, and he fastens things together in such a way that's strong and fit, and it will not come apart. He's a master assembler, and so his nails. I mean, he's just not driving nails willy-nilly. He's putting them in at the right place and doing it skillfully so that this thing is constructed and strong and it will stay together. He said that's what the words of the wise are like. I think the last phrase of verse 11 is interesting. Given from one shepherd. I think there is a claim to inspiration on the part of Solomon. The one shepherd being God. That these are wise words given from one shepherd. I think Solomon there is laying a claim to inspiration. But then he contrasts these wise words that he has just spoken by inspiration with just words in general. Verse 12, further, by these my son be admonished, of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. I think there he's contrasting these wise words that he has spoken by inspiration to all the other things that men might say, do, or write that actually become a weariness of the flesh. Of making many books there is no end. Well, that's the truth, isn't it? Near where we used to live was a books a million. Well, the implication of the name of that store is there's a million books here. And I don't know. I doubt that they literally had a million in that one store, but probably you could, through them, you could access a million books, I don't doubt. All kind of books. Solomon said there's a difference between that which comes from the one true shepherd and all the other many books that men might write. And I really think there's good spiritual advice there. Through the years, I have known, and you may have known as well, Christians, but even preachers who became enamored with the writings of certain denominational authors who were not basing their instruction on the Word of God. And I've known people to be carried away with it because this author is just a real skillful writer. And he says things in interesting ways, but they're not true. And people latch on to that and follow after some of these denominational authors to their to their spiritual destruction. And so just be advised, there's a message that comes from the one true shepherd. And so be cautious about other things that don't come from that same source. Thoughts or comments here, anybody? All right, you know the last two verses. What a fitting end to this whole pursuit. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter, verse 13. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. So here's Solomon, who has sort of described his own pursuit of life's meaning. What is the meaning of life? As we've said over and over again in our study, Solomon was uniquely qualified to try everything, and he did. And so every kind of physical pleasure, wealth, fame, prosperity, hugely famous. Of course, he had 1,000 women. I mean, anything that you could imagine that a man might try in order to gain satisfaction. And he tried them all. And he said, and his view of all that is that's vanity and vexation. It brought him no satisfaction. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter then. What is the conclusion of the whole matter? Fear God and keep His commandments. This is the whole duty, man. So here's Solomon, who's saying that the things that so often distract us, money and pleasure, position, fame, influence, the things that we might be tempted to go after. I want to tell you, you would never be able to pursue those things at the level Solomon did. And Solomon is telling you it won't get you where you want to be. That is not going to bring satisfaction. Let's hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep His commandments. This is the whole duty of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. I just think that is such a worthy conclusion of the whole book of Ecclesiastes to just bring it together into a nutshell. This is the ultimate conclusion. Thoughts or comments on this? We're just out of time. Anybody? All right. I think that's a great study. Remember, too, that we have said Ecclesiastes is a book that, unfortunately, some people will misuse. They'll take some statements out of context to reach false conclusions. And that's why we've shown this chart. Week after week, we've shown this chart. Make sure you know what the immediate context is where Solomon is speaking. Because if you take some of those quotes from those sections where he's talking about life without God, you can come to misunderstandings, false conclusions, and people do. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the book of Ecclesiastes as much as I have. Really good. Lord willing, next Sunday we'll start into the book of Hebrews. Thanks, everybody.